think we know this story. We've known it for so long that we've domesticated it, sterilized it, stripped it of danger. We've turned a violent encounter with ultimate reality into a harmless illustration, a small bush, a beautiful flame, a prophet receiving his calling, a children's story, a metaphor, something safe. But stop. Moses was not standing in front of a picture. He was standing in front of an ontological anomaly, a breach in reality that violated everything he understood about the natural world. And Moses understood fire. He had lived in the desert for 40 years as a survivor. He knew how quickly flames consume, how nothing burns gently in the wilderness. And yet, a thorn bush was burning, and it was not being consumed. That should have shattered his instincts. But the fire was not what made Moses tremble. The terror came from realizing that an intelligence was inside the fire, a sovereign presence, aware, intentional watching. Not an idea, not a metaphor, not a symbol meant to inspire. A presence powerful enough to existentially dissolve him if he stepped too close. So let me ask the question we rarely dare to ask: if this was only a symbol, why did Moses hide his face? And even more unsettling, why would a symbol demand that he remove his sandals? Why would holiness claim physical space with such authority? Because once we stop domesticating the story, we are forced to face a far more dangerous possibility: that the God who spoke from the fire was not explaining reality. He was invading it. And today, we're not looking for a moral lesson. We're tracing the evidence of that invasion. We often approach the story of the burning bush with a comfortable assumption that the bush is merely a theological symbol, a visual metaphor chosen to communicate holiness in abstract terms. It sounds reasonable, safe even, but that assumption quietly drains the text of its force. Because Exodus chapter 3 is not written as poetry. It is written as an encounter. This is not a scene where a man stands at a distance, reflecting on an idea. It is a moment where a human being is pulled into the center of a presence that refuses to remain symbolic. Everything begins with a detail we tend to overlook. The Hebrew word for bush is seneh. Not an oak tree, strong, noble, enduring. Not a cedar majestic royal associated with temples and power, but a thorn bush low to the ground, sharp, irritating, easily dismissed. A plant associated with dry land, hardship, and curse. That choice is not accidental. In the world Moses came from, ancient Egypt divinity was always tied to grandeur, to height, to distance. The god Ra was the sun itself, fire from above, untouchable, overwhelming, destructive. A flame that ruled by separation. But the God who meets Moses does the opposite. He does not send fire from the sky. He places fire inside something fragile. The flame does not dominate from a distance. It voluntarily compresses itself. It enters a finite object and remains there without destroying it. And there is a subtle prophetic echo in the word Seneh itself. Its sound closely resembles Sinai. The fire that appears in a nameless bush will soon cover an entire mountain. But revelation does not begin at the summit. It begins at ground level in something small, unimpressive, and ignored. It is as if an emperor walks past marble palaces and ceremonial avenues, steps into a dark, foul-smelling alley and declares, "This is where my throne truly stands." This is not shock value, it is theology. Power, according to this God, does not require spectacle. But the thorn bush carries another layer of meaning. In Genesis, thorns and thistles mark a fallen world creation where everything burns and eventually collapses. Energy is consumed, life decays, nothing lasts. And yet, at Horeb, Moses encounters a contradiction: fire that burns without consuming. what theologians have called the unconsumed fire. This is not passive holiness. It is invasive holiness. Instead of avoiding what is cursed, holiness moves directly into it, not to annihilate it, but to transform it from within. God is not staging a miracle for effect. He is performing a reversal. The very thing that should be destroyed becomes the bearer of glory. Imagine a nuclear reaction. Left unchecked, it obliterates everything. But here it is held in a supernatural equilibrium, radiating energy, glowing with power, yet preserving the structure that contains it. This fire does not depend on fuel from the fallen world. It is self-sustaining, and because of that it can dwell among thorns without turning them to ash. That alone raises an unsettling question. If divine holiness can coexist with the thorn bush without destroying it, what does that imply for human beings flawed, scarred, and yet longing to burn with purpose? Still, one might insist, this is all literary imagery, a metaphor carefully crafted for reflection, but the text refuses to let us remain there, because metaphors suggest, they do not summon. Then comes the voice, Moses. Moses. In theology, this is called interpellation, a personal summons that establishes obligation. The repetition is not poetic flair. It signals urgency and covenantal address. This is not information being delivered. This is a life being claimed. A symbol is like a road sign. You can notice it and move on. But when your name is called in the wilderness, neutrality disappears. You are no longer an observer. You are involved. Immediately after the call comes a boundary. Do not come any closer. This is not rejection. It is a warning about compatibility, like the event horizon of a black hole. Holiness creates a threshold beyond which ordinary conditions no longer apply. It generates a field gravitational pull that redefines proximity itself. Impurity cannot simply wander inward without consequence. Holiness here is not moral theory. It is an objective reality that governs space. And then comes the command that modern readers find most uncomfortable. Take off your sandals. In the ancient world, sandals were often made from the skin of dead animals. They represented protection, mediation, distance from the ground. To remove them is to shed layers of death and artificial security. To step onto holy ground barefoot is to let living flesh meet living reality without insulation. Faith in this moment is not intellectual. It is embodied. It passes through skin and nerve endings, through hot sand, through vulnerability. Moses is not asked to understand holiness. He is asked to stand exposed before it. And the question presses forward, unavoidable. Why are we so determined to approach God while still wearing our shoes, our titles, assumptions, defenses, and safe distances? When Moses' bare feet touch the burning sand, he understands something with terrifying clarity. He is not interpreting a symbol. He is standing before an interface where the infinite compresses himself into a thorn bush so that a finite human being can survive the encounter. What Moses encounters at the burning bush is not merely a symbol. It is a theophania moment when God does not point to truth from a distance, but enters history in a form a human being can endure. The text introduces an unsettling tension. It says, "The angel of the Lord appeared yet moments later." God himself speaks from within the bush. This is not confusion. It reflects an ancient legal and theological logic known as the shaliach principle. In Jewish law, a shaliachin authorized agent does not merely deliver messages. The rule was clear. The agent of a person is the person himself. The issue is not essence, but authority. When the angel of the Lord speaks, he does so with the full authority of God, not as a rival, not as a lesser deity, but as God's mediated presence. Think of a royal seal. Ink on parchment means nothing until it bears the king's signet. Once sealed, the document is not suggestion. It is law. The angel of the Lord functions the same way a physical bearer of divine authority that Moses can encounter without being destroyed. But authority alone does not solve the deeper problem. How can the infinite draw near without annihilating the finite? This is where the bush itself becomes the key. The burning bush is an interface. An interface is not the essence of a system. It is the point of contact that makes interaction possible. What we see here is divine accommodation. God voluntarily adjusting the mode of his self-disclosure to human limitation. Not because he is weakened, but because we are. You might say God compresses his presence, not reducing his power, but restraining it, like a VR headset that limits overwhelming data so the mind does not collapse. The bush becomes a controlled access point into a reality far too vast for direct exposure. The interface is not God, but without the interface there would be no encounter. And when that interface opens, it does not produce comfort. It produces awe, not terror, but something deeper. Terror fears an enemy. Awe recognizes ontological fragility, the realization that your existence is unbearably small before absolute reality. Moses hides his face not because the light is too bright, but because the truth is too heavy. Standing before unbounded being, every bounded being becomes aware of how easily it could cease to exist. Then, God does something even more destabilizing. He names himself. In the ancient world, to know a name was to gain leverage, to define, to control. Moses asks for God's name expecting a category. What he receives instead is a refusal. I am who I am. This is not a name in the ordinary sense. It is a metaphysical declaration. God does not identify himself as a being. He reveals himself as being itself, the ground of all existence. It is a theological takeover. When God says I am, every other I am becomes dependent, borrowed, and fragile. Like electricity speaking to a light bulb, you do not generate light. Light flows through you. And yet Moses remains standing, because the infinite has chosen to meet him through a bush that burns without consuming, through an interface calibrated not to destroy, but to reveal. What is most unsettling about the burning bush is not the fire, but the silence of the text. Exodus chapter 3 is almost ruthless in its restraint. It offers no analysis, no mechanism, no curiosity that would satisfy the modern scientific mind. Scripture does not ask how the fire works. It does not explain why the bush is not consumed. It shows no interest in the physics of the miracle at all. And that silence is not a weakness. It is intentional. Because the moment God explains the mechanism of the fire, he becomes an object, something to be examined, measured, and mastered. But in Scripture, God never allows himself to become an object of investigation. He remains the subject, the one who speaks, who calls, who commands a response. This silence establishes what theologians call the sovereignty of revelation. In the biblical worldview, knowledge of God is never the result of dissecting data. It is the result of obedience to a call. If Moses were allowed to fixate on how the fire functioned, the burning bush would become a research project. But God does not appear to stimulate curiosity. He appears to commission a servant. Think of a death sentence. You do not care about the chemistry of the ink or the fibers of the paper. What makes you tremble is the signature at the bottom, the authority behind it. Scripture deliberately ignores the ink of the miracle so that you are forced to confront the signature of the Creator. And at that moment, the entire focus of the text collapses into a name. I am who I am. This is not a name in the ordinary sense. It is an ontological declaration. In the ancient world, to know a God's name was to gain leverage, to invoke, manipulate, and control. When Moses asks for God's name, he is doing what humans have always done, attempting to frame ultimate reality in language. God refuses. I am. Who I am is a rejection of every attempt at control. God does not identify himself as a being within the universe. He identifies himself as being itself. He does not possess existence. He is the source of it. He depends on nothing in order to be. This is what theologians mean by acid self-existence. This declaration strikes at the heart of Egyptian polytheism. The gods of Egypt required temples, rituals, and human recognition to survive. The God of Moses declares that he exists entirely independent of Israel, of Pharaoh, and of the world itself. Imagine a character inside a video game saying, I am because the code allows it. But when the source code itself speaks and says, I am, it is declaring that it does not belong to the simulation. It is reality. Everything else is a shadow. In this moment, God reveals himself as the very source code of existence. And when that name is spoken, the burning bush ceases to be a local phenomenon. It becomes a singularity, a point where the full weight of ultimate reality collapses into a single moment in history. If I am is present here, then Pharaoh is no sun god. He is a pretender ruling over a borrowed world. The burning bush becomes a fracture in the material order, a crack in the wall revealing who truly owns the house. It is like looking into a mirror. At first you see a small flame, but the longer you look, the more you see the entire universe and your own soul reflected back at you. This moment is cosmic, not because of its size, but because it shatters humanity's frame of reference. And this is why Scripture refuses to explain the fire. Because the most dangerous thing is not understanding the phenomenon, but being forced to respond to the one who simply is. Moses did not encounter the burning bush by accident. He had to turn aside, step off the familiar path, interrupt his routine, leave the safety of what he thought he already understood. The miracle did not happen because the bush suddenly caught fire. The miracle happened because Moses stopped walking past it, because he was willing to pause, to risk confusion, to step out of the quiet certainty of habit, and that leads to a haunting possibility. What if the bush was never the anomaly? What if it was always burning? And what if the real anomaly is us? A generation so familiar with sacred language that we no longer recognize sacred presence. So here is the invitation. Don't just read Scripture. Stop treating the text as a dead artifact. Treat it as a living mirror. Let it read you. And if necessary, let that fire burn away the old sandals of your certainty, the worn-out assumptions, the comfortable conclusions, even the religious armor that keeps you informed but untouched. That is the history. But now the question belongs to you. What do you think this really was? A physical portal that warps space and time, a historical legend designed to shake a nation, or something that refuses to fit into either category? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them. We learned from them. And your perspective may shape where this conversation goes next. And if you're someone who refuses to settle for easy answers, if you're drawn to questions that don't just inform you but unsettle you, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey with us. Because some fires were never meant to be explained, only encountered. The desert is still quiet, but the fire is still there.